when Man in the Box came out, and I bought that album, and I go, oh, it's another hair band, but boy, I love it. And then the album was great. And then they did Jar of Flies and went into another dimension. And I went, okay, now we're talking Beatle level. Now we're talking true artist level. And they had me from that point on.
And they're unplugged.
Yeah,
it's still,
band.
one of the very best of all time.
Yes, it is, Bruce. You're right.
And they did something unique too, sonically, where so many of their songs, it's like, the vocal is in harmony throughout the whole track, which is very unique.
And they've got that John Lennon trick. The harmonies underneath the melody.
Yeah.
Like the early John Lennon songs, it would be Paul, I'm so in love with, and John's in love with you, that lower line. I'm not trying to stay in tune, folks, but you know what I'm saying? John was the master of hiding his harmonies underneath the melody line. Okay.
Yeah.
And that's what Alice in Chains did all of the time, and they were the first band to utilize it as often as the Beatles did. And that's by the way, one of these days I'm going to do a video on the greatest secrets about the Beatles and why they were so successful. And that's one of the things I would bring out is John Lennon and Paul McCartney developing that wonderful kind of gravelly John Lennon voice hiding under the sweet Paul McCartney, especially on earlier Beatles songs. It's like magic. It's gold. They are the greatest band on the planet Earth. That's all there is to it. They rewrote the fabric of pop music, if not music itself. They're on Beethoven's level. They're on Bach's level. For the 20th century.
What's really staggering too about the Beatles, which doesn't get talked about enough, is we have their catalog, which is amazing. I mean, just on its own. Think of all the music that they gave us just through the people that they've inspired through the years. I mean, there's so many bands and catalogs we would not have if it wasn't for them.
That's
and the inspiration that they gave to others.
Yeah.
Inspired. We wouldn't have had the Stones as the Stones are and have been since the breakup of the Beatles if the Beatles hadn't existed. The Stones were a one-trick pony when they came out, and they were great at doing it. All right. They were a blues cover band. All right. They could kick it into high gear and make it popish. That was their whole trick. That was it. All right. Then they watched John Lennon and Paul McCartney go into a corner, spend 20 minutes, and write I Want to Be Your Man. And it did something to Mick and Keith anyway, right? Yeah. And they turned into something else. Every other band on the planet was doing the same thing. Not just in England. They were doing it here in the United States. It took the United States a while to recatch its breath and to offer something on that level.
Well, I also remember, though, that the Stones... The Beatles were number one. They came out, they started the British invasion, then we had that whole explosion. But the Stones actually pulled up, to me, like almost even with them. And people were dividing across lines. If you weren't dividing between the Beach Boys and the Beatles, you were dividing between the Beatles and the Rolling Stones.
Mm-hmm.
And they were right there with the Beatles for a while, and they were a little edgier than the Beatles. The Beatles were more wholesome sounding. The Stones were a little, when I say raunchy, I mean that in a good way, rock and roll way, And a lot of people were starting to prefer the Stones over the Beatles.
Oh, I knew friends who loved the Stones, couldn't stand the Beatles,
Right. Well,
they were just too safe for them.
I liked them both, always did,
Me too. Yeah, me too. I think the Rolling Stones is the most improved band in rock. Yeah. If you ask me. They started at this level and they wound up on Beatle level as far as even writing. You know? I mean, and when the Beatles faded and they were bitching at each other, well, I don't like Ram. Right. Well, I don't like Imagine. How do you sleep, Paul? Right? And they're doing that stuff. The Stones provides us with Sticky Fingers, hit after hit after hit, and they don't sound like the Beatles anymore. Anyway,
you can go all the way back to Ruby Tuesday and Paint It Black and Jumping Jack Flash, and those songs are great even today to listen to.
Oh yeah, absolutely,
without a doubt.
Yeah,
but with Sticky Fingers, they had a new sound. That was 70s, baby. That was 70s.
That was a total game changer. One band I got to bring up again, and that's Jethro Tull. I did see live in concert, and what a spectacle to see Ian Anderson up there at the time. Long flowing hair almost to the ground, playing his flute like you've never seen anybody play a flute before. Never see anybody play one in a rock band, that's for damn sure. And any time I saw anybody else trying to play one, almost nothing came out. Play was just incredible.
I went to see them on their Passion Play tour. At the Cow Palace, and it was like, I just couldn't believe it. I go, lead flute. I kept telling my friends all night, imagine that, lead flute.
But the thing about Jethro Tull is you can compare the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, or you can debate who you thought was better between the. My cousins all lived in California. I lived out in the Nevada desert. They loved the Beach Boys, and I would go there and I would argue on behalf of the Beatles, and we'd take turns naming hits of the bands that we liked the best, you know. And it usually ended a draw, but they were both great bands. But there is nobody you can compare with Jethro Tull. You can't sit there and say, you know, they got it from the Beatles, they got it from the Stones, they got it from, you know, Willie Dixon. No, they are so unique. There's nothing like them out there.
Well, they're unique from what they started off as, even. They were a bar blues band to begin with.
Yeah, you know? Michael, you've always talked about too, like lyrics, and I think too, like Ian Anderson brings. I mean, you might talk about like underrated lyricists. He brings a very definite point of view to things, and very. I love. I mean, like the Aqualung, all the lyrics on that, and the writing on that, like that's top notch.
Right.
Aqualung is prophetic.
Absolutely.
It talks about the homeless and mental illness that we are seeing today in 2023, and it's all characterized by the character Aqualung. And if you listen to side 2, that's Aqualung's childhood. And he's the young man who was raised in the church, higher education, with their God tucked up underneath my arm, right? And he turned into a lascivious snake of a human being watching pretty panties run. You know? That's brilliant, folks.
Oh, that's brilliant. Even like a mainstream hit like Bungo in the Jungle has a very cynical outlook to it, and it touches upon things like that, and, you know, things like The Teacher. I mean, you know, just great writing.
Right. Yes, you're right, Bruce.
Great writing.
He's one of my favorite, you know, they're in my Mount Rock Olympus of all bands. You know, Jethro Tull's one of the top 13 bands in rock and roll, in my opinion. They're every bit as good as Yes. They're every bit as good as Deep Purple. You know, I mean, we're talking monster bands, and Jethro Tull's right there. And guess what? They just released a fantastic album.